On to our next session. This, I think, is going to be a really useful session, as this is something I know I've struggled with in the past, and I think it's something that, as an industry, we're attempting to make a more concerted effort on, but could definitely do with some guidance. So, with all that said, I am going to get out of the way and hand over to Rubina for her session.
Sure. Good morning. Thank you for having me here, Tom. I'm really happy to present on this topic. I've came across learning about a lot of inclusive design recently, especially in the last couple of years. It's with what's happening in the world and globally, locally. And so I think it's just really time for us to kind of learn to make our training more inclusive, more accessible, especially for all of our learners, and figuring out how to appropriately select images for our training to make them more engaging to a wider audience than what we've seen in the norm. And so in the last couple of years, I've noticed a lot, especially for myself as a trainer, that I too make mistakes unbeknownst to myself from an unconscious bias standpoint or whatever, just seeing the most amount of images and illustrations being a part of the norm, but then there's excluded groups from there. And so I want to be very consciously aware, and address that in my own training. And hopefully I can share some tips and tricks with you all as well. So just to start off, to give you a basic definition of inclusive design is design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. So it is a broad spectrum. And for lots of instructional designers, when they think about working on trainings, how do you address all these abilities? How do you address all these differences, right? It just feels like it's now an overwhelming task. It really isn't if you start thinking about the specific learners that you are addressing in your training. When you think about it in those terms, it gets a little bit more clear for you and a little bit more purposeful and meaningful to that specific audience. So when we're talking about inclusive design, we want to keep in mind representation and what that means. I looked up a lot of different websites for definitions and trying to find an applicable definition for representation as it should be interpreted today for the social landscape that we're in right now. A lot of people in a lot of groups are feeling marginalized or excluded. And so I made this definition, an operable definition for instructional designers specifically. So in representation, when we're thinking about designing our own training, you want to create appropriate depictions of otherwise excluded or marginalized audience groups in order for them to feel seen, heard, and understood. So if you're trying to figure out why is representation important, why does it matter, people want to feel seen when they're taking their trainings, they want to feel heard, and they want to feel understood. So there's definite ways that you can do that with your image selection, with your illustration selection, with your icons that you put into there that are representative of people in your training. Keep in mind to address the other folks that shouldn't actually be othered, but perhaps be just included. Don't miss them. Make sure you catch them. One really good example of this happening in the broad landscape, especially just recently, and I'm already smiling thinking about it. When I think about it in terms of what does it mean to be excluded and now then mindful and included, I think about this movie that I saw with my kids, Encanto, Disney's Encanto. And if you've seen it, please share so in the chat. That would be lovely to find out if anybody else has had this experience as well. I started seeing these articles pop up and these pictures pop up on various social media feeds, from Twitter to Facebook to LinkedIn, to Reddit, to Medium, it was just so fantastic to see all these social spaces lightening up, and people kind of just getting it, that there were Disney princess movies. There is this norm of having a certain look or a certain feature predominantly, and we have now, in the Disney landscape, they have changed, they have grown, they have evolved, they are developing, and they're trying to be more inclusive. And what does that look like? Well, look at the images they're presenting now in Encanto. There's a 2-year-old girl that you see here. She just thinks that she looks like Mirabelle. When she sees Mirabelle in herself, that is just such a light up moment. And for a lot of us, for a lot of generations of time, we just never really thought about that. And I mean us as a whole, as a populace, going to Disney movies and seeing images like Snow White, or seeing images like Cinderella. Well, yes, we see those images and we like the princess movies, or don't like the princess movies, depending upon what you think about them in general. But we see the similar types of images, and we never really even realized that there's a lot of girls who just don't feel seen. Do we want them to feel that way? I don't think so. Do you want your learners to feel that way? I would not think so, and I hope that you agree. The images that you select draws in your intended audience. You want to make sure that your audience feels seen, heard, and understood. And just use this example that you see from Encanto, the little girl here and the little boy here, and them just seeing representations that look like them. It draws them in. We have done this for a broad audience for generations of time. There are, in the US, a great many American girls that do look like Cinderella and that do look like Snow White, but we just really haven't had a Mirabelle until now, and we really need it. So things like Moana, that has also come out, it's giving these representations that people really need to see. There's more than just what you think maybe there in your overall broad audience. There's other people that you need to draw in as well. So here's a demographic checklist. This is the meat and bones of things that practitioners really need to use for themselves in their training. One thing you want to look at is the different races, plural, that you're going to have to address in your audience when you start learning about them, and ethnicities. You have African ethnicities, Hispanic ethnicities, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern. There's a lot of different range in just thinking about that one demographic spectrum. There's a lot to look at there. Genders. We have a broad range and many different ways that people are identifying themselves. When people are identifying themselves in a certain way, are the images that you put in your training resonant with those folks that you are giving your training to? Are you including images in, or are you excluding by not including those images in? Does that make your training resonant with your learners, or does it make them disengaged from training? I've been myself, if I can think about it, for the different identities that I represent, both ethnicity and being a woman of color and whatnot. I also think when I'm taking training too, oh my gosh, this is boring training. It doesn't resonate with me because I really don't see myself in it. It's not practical to me, right? So you've heard learners give that kind of response. There's other things that are going on there as well that we should address and that we should include into our training. It should be a best practice to make sure that we address these things. Same thing with ages. If you have a different age range of learners in your training, even in adult training, let's just say, for instance, you have adult learners in your training. You're doing an onboarding training. Well, you may have a range of age of learners. So you're going to then have to make your training accessible to the different ages of learners that you have in there. As we know, just stereotypically speaking, that older learners that are perhaps not as technically engage, like their digital literacy isn't as high, statistically speaking, and they may need greater font. So you make bigger font because you want to make your training accessible to those adult learners or learners that have visual challenges. Same way that you want to also keep that in mind when you're looking for these other factors as well: races, genders, different neurodiversity behaviors, and or even body types. If you look through your training and everybody is all looking around the same, are you then inadvertently, unconsciously, but still a bias, are you giving up a bias that you didn't intend to have by not having people of all parts of the human diversity represented in your training at some point? What I want to say is that you want to include people in carefully, artistically, aesthetically. You never want to make that mistake of just throwing pictures to just throw pictures in there. And I'll step you through in a minute of how to change this. One thing you can do, I'll share this at the end of the talk, and I will have this presentation available on my website as well, is to look at the source forum, one, how to choose diverse and inclusive photos. It's a great place for you to learn more about this information. The checklist came right from there, and really opened my eyes to a lot more things that I just really didn't think about in terms of making inclusive training that I very actively and intentionally do now because of this. Digging down. When you're looking at pictures and you're sitting there and you're in your design stage or development stage or wherever you are thinking about putting images in your training, here are some questions that you just want to ask yourself. Who is missing or excluded? You put in a bunch of images, go look back at it, see what you have, see if there is an imbalance in there somewhere. I have done that and actually seen, oh my goodness, you know what? I didn't address this type of person. I didn't address this type of group that the learning is going to, that the audience is actually a part of. I did not bring those people in with the images that I put up on my training. And I found that, and then I addressed it. Can any photos be swapped out for a different type of person? Sure, certainly, why not? When you recognize it, address it, fix it, simple things that you can do. Would you want to be portrayed this way? This is a specific question, meaning that I myself have had this experience of, I come from a Indian Pakistani heritage, and a lot of people know that. And I am also an instructional designer. I've seen some photos that have gone out that people have thought represent me, but it really doesn't identify with me. Meaning that if I am growing up here in America, well, I'm also second generation and I dress a certain way as I do now. I'm not necessarily in cultural attire for a business a function, and that's just here in the US. So when I see folks in a US training and I see a picture of Indian people who are in cultural garb in that training, I go, wait a minute, there's something a little bit incorrect about it, or something wrong about it, or something not necessarily offensive, but it's not representative. It's not the portrayal that I wish to have had for that particular type of moment. So please don't just think that you're picking an Indian person from wherever and putting that in if it actually doesn't look like the landscape that you are addressing, like the learners that you're actually addressing. Know your learners. And I'll show you with that in a minute of how to do that. But keep this question in mind, especially for the types of pictures that you pick. Make sure they are appropriate and representative. Would you want to be portrayed that way? Do you want to, let's say you are Caucasian, for example, just to see if this can resonate with you. if you were Caucasian, would you want to be in a wedding dress in a business meeting? Perhaps not, unless we're talking about wedding dress sales or something. That's how it felt to me when I saw the picture of cultural garb in a business setting. It just wasn't the right fit. So I hope that resonates with you, and I hope you understand that. And if you have any other questions about that, how to do that more specifically, or how to keep away from perhaps misrepresenting somebody, please do follow up with me and ask. Are there any stereotypes being perpetuated in the photo I'm using? I think I pretty much just discussed that ad nauseum right now, addressing that question. Am I depicting someone in the role our culture typically puts them in, or making a more unexpected choice? Again, depending upon the learner audience that you have, make sure you know them, make sure you're able to understand them, make sure you're able to accurately represent them. Please don't put anything offensive about them. And if you really are not sure, ask learner, ask people that are going to be receiving the training, and make sure that that is a part of your best practice before you hit publish on that training. And it goes to that huge audience. Take a moment to ask the people that your training is going to be addressing and see what they think. Put yourself through a review and see if the pictures that you've selected are appropriate for that audience. Can everyone who might view the photos see someone like themselves represented in it? Yeah, why not? We naturally, automatically, our norm, our knee-jerk reaction, you can see thousands and thousands of photos of what the norm looks like, of what typical situations look like. However, there's a lot of groups of people who are missed by that, because those photos haven't even been taken in a lot of instances. Those photos are much more difficult to find, a little bit less so these days. There's a lot of new things happening, and which is wonderful. So people in the digital spaces are actually very intentionally giving us pictures and portrayals, which is wonderful to see. And so it's now our job to put that responsibility on ourselves, put ourselves in the driver's seat, put ourselves in the seat of the learner always, right? Because nobody else is around there in the room to talk about the learner. You've got your project manager, you've got your stakeholders, you've got your SMEs, and then you've got you. You really don't have your learner in the room a lot of the times when you're making these trainings for them. So you're the one who's going to have to speak up for them and make sure that you're representing them accurately and respectfully. Project planning, nuts and bolts, right? What do you do? How do you do? When do you do? At what point in the project do you consider inclusive images? Well, I like to put this under the accessibility umbrella, and accessibility issues are things that are universal for me, that I have to make sure that my training addresses on the onset of creating any new training. I am going to be having an accessibility discussion at the beginning, either with the SMEs and the stakeholders and the project managers, whatever your specific work environment looks like, and or the instructional designers that you work with in a team if you have a team. Make sure you do have those discussions, or make sure you do make those determinations when you're thinking about accessibility. And when do you think about accessibility? At the beginning. So this just goes right there in that space. In the analysis phase, if we're using ADDIE as our model, in the analysis phase, know your audience. There's plenty of things that you can do to do that. Make that your best practice. Know your audience. Who are they? Design. In the design phase, when you start selecting images to represent that learner audience, make sure they are appropriate for your training. They relate, they reflect well, they're not considered offensive or objective, or let's say stereotypical. You want to be careful about that. And you want to perhaps pull in more learners into your design of your training, user testers and things like that, into the project planning of your training. you go to release. That's something that I've had to learn for several years now to really get to, and I hope, and I feel that I am able to get to that point now. I do ask my project managers about learners, learning audience, and if I can interact with them in any way, shape, form possible. I at least ask the question to see if I can get a yes. And at this point, I don't settle for a no, just because I feel to be an inclusive instructional designer, I've got to include those learners in my product development. And so now I just make it imperative that I may or may not take a training project on based upon if I can interact with the learner, because that's how much I feel that I'm responsible for making something that they are going to want to take. So know your audience, select appropriate images, icons, or illustrations, and make sure that you address those accessibility needs in terms of gender, ethnicity, race, anything of the human diverse definitions that we have, as broad as they are, which learners are in your training, and then make sure that you are able to pepper them in so that they can be seen, heard, and understood. Development phase. In your development phase, at some point, I really hope everybody runs a review cycle, right? You make your training, you want to hit publish as soon as possible, you want to release it out into the world, and it's a great, fabulous training, and you can't wait to go, but you always have to do a review cycle, right? And I hope that you are before you hit publish, because if you're not doing that, oh my gosh, please do that. So you go to a feedback and review cycle, you give it to your SMEs, but you should also run a review cycle with your learners. Get a sample, get some user testers, get some folks that are inside your place. If you need to find people, go find people that you can have as a small user tester that represent the audience that you're giving the training to give you feedback on the images that you're selecting, on the appropriateness of them, and talk to people, because the worst thing that you can ever do is to publish it and then you get bounce back, and then you get backlash, and then you get comments, and then you get people saying, wait a minute, this is really offensive to me. You want to avoid that. So somewhere in there, as you're doing your proofreading phases, as you're doing your content review, your proofreading review, all of that stuff, make sure you also build in a user tester review cycle and figure out if you've included people appropriately and or excluded anybody. Also give those user testers those questions to then check out the training and see if it makes sense. And that's the best way to do that, really. Assessing your learner audience. There's multiple ways to do this. There's multiple ways to figure out who your learning audience is. I know that especially newer instructional designers tend to have these issues, but also senior instructional designers, mid-level, senior, wherever you are, we all have problems trying to figure out who the learning audience is. And I've been able to successfully break through that in some of my trainings, and now I'm just doing it more and more and more. The first time I tried was very difficult. It was a mountain climb, but I was able to get through it. Ask your SMEs. If they don't know, take an opportunity to discuss why inclusive design is important, why understanding and addressing accessibility is important, and run through figuring out a learner assessment. You need to know who they are. Survey learners, determine the demographics and accessibility needs. And lastly, the thing that you could do is run a population or demographic data search. I end up going to the Brookings Institute and looking at maps to figure out racial identities of different people. And there's lots of things out there. You can also go to the US Census Bureau and get very mired in all sorts of maps and figures. You could do a Wikipedia search of your state. If you're addressing a state training or a certain region in that state, figure out what the demographics are, figure out who the learners are, and then address your training images towards those folks. Where to find diverse images. Again, I'll post this up on my website as well in a couple of days. Just check back, it'll be there. And I will give you access to all of these different links. These are the ones that I've chosen for photos, icons, and illustrations. And then again, you don't have to just stop there, and you don't have to keep worrying about, oh my gosh, is it licensed? Can I get it? Can I pay for it? Is my boss going to pay for it? Whatever. Get creative. Include your audience in your training. I'm doing that now with my current training, and I absolutely love it. I'm trying to figure out who the folks are that are going to be taking this particular training, and I'm so excited to include them in. I am actually reaching out and saying, hey, can I have photos of X, Y, and Z of you and your environment? I would love to put that in my training. Would you be willing to help out with that? So that is just a little bit of tidbit there for you that you could do. And it just makes your training more lively and engaging for them. And why not? Thank you. Questions, comments, feedback, please reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Rabina Hawani, and you can find me on my website, rabinahawani.com. Please try what you can to make your training more inclusive and accessible for your audience, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I'll stay for a little bit and try to answer what I can. Tom, thank you for having me here, and thank you for putting on this really great conference, and I hope that people stay for other speakers as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. And we've already got a question come through, actually. So let me throw that up from Morgan. How do you handle these questions when there are people involved who don't care or think there is sort of a time budget issue around reviewing the product and getting it up to standards regarding inclusion?
Do it anyway. What do you have to worry about them? You're the instructional designer. You're the one in control of your training development. If you're going to put in any image, any icon, or any illustration anyway, then go ahead and make sure that it is inclusive.
Cool. I guess it's almost a case of do it, and then they can't have that issue to an extent.
There's no issue. It kind of gets around it and stuff. Being an inclusive designer kind of makes you responsible and accountable for that. And then there is a definite ROI. There's lots of other, there's a huge body of research that's out right now saying that there's absolute ROI, that your training is going to be well received by that audience, by your audience that you have. I put an African American in there just to put an African American in there. That's not the conversation I'm having. I'm saying know that audience's particular learning needs, learning styles, diversities, neurodiversities, where they're coming from, who they are. Know that audience, the diversity that is in just that audience, and then address that with your images and illustrations. That will increase your product quality and the engagement from the learner. So there is a definite ROI positive effect. So there should not be a question about time and budget and all of that. You're putting it in there so that you have a great product that you're pushing out.
Awesome. And there's another one just here. So great session, thank you. And what is the relation of your lecture with the DEI measures?
Let's talk offline about that. But with a great, I'm not sure if I get that specifically enough for what he's asking, or Tom, if you want to help me interpret that one.
No, I don't think I'm the right person to.
Sure, no worries, no worries.
But what I would say is, yeah, drop that you can do private messaging on this platform. Some people have messaged me already, so go for that. Not because no one else should see it, but just because I think there might need to be a bit of a back and forth. It might be easier for you guys. Awesome. And I think actually, just before we wrap up, the one thing that struck me is that what you were talking about addressing the diversity of your intended audience, as opposed to trying to make everything just globally diverse,
Yeah,
which I
that's
think
not.
is where we've gone wrong for a very long time on this point.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It's not just diversity for the sake of diversity so that you feel like you've checked it off and stuff. That's not the discussion here. You want to know your learning audience. You want to make sure that they are being represented in your training. And so I can't, express that, important, point enough.
Yeah.
It's about your training, your audience. That's who you're addressing, and that's what you want to make sure that they're being heard, welcomed, and included. Make sure you are.
Awesome. Well, I don't think there are any more questions. I'll just check the other place that occasionally they've been going.
Sure.
But no, I think we're good for questions. Obviously, if anyone has more in future,
Sure.
I think Ramina's left us with some fantastic resources there. Her website's full of stuff like that. It's an excellent place to go. But thank you so much for taking the time to present to us all today. And our next session is at 4 p.m. Yep, 4 p.m. It is p.m. The day's flying past. UK time, at least here. And it's with Lauren Waldman, the Learning Pirate. And we're looking at designing learning with the brain in mind. So we've got some learning science coming up this afternoon. So until then, we've got just under half an hour. I keep saying go to the networking areas, go to the chat sessions. No one's ever in the chat sessions.
No one ever goes there.
It's just me eating biscuits at the minute. It's really awkward. So if you do want to drop in, come and have a biscuit. You can't have mine, but you can bring your own. Thanks,
and
everyone.
how are you doing, Tom? How have you been?
Eating a lot of biscuits. That's the answer. Anyway, we will see you in the next session, everyone. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye.